Great. Thank you for joining us. Today, our panel will explore the future of GIS data curation in libraries, and the speakers will address the traditional ways libraries have incorporated GIS services, how researchers are using GIS. So we're going to start off, and Michael Elliott, an assistant professor at biostatistics at SLU, will talk about his research using GIS.
Who recognizes this? So I put this up here just to sort of show that public health has a long history with geospatial data. This was one of the earliest studies before we had electronic geospatial data using GIS. So more recently, we've sort of upgraded. We now use computers, and I have a series of maps that have been used very successfully by public health entities showing some of the problems that we're having in this country with the obesity epidemic. So we'll go through these quickly. You can see basically this is to show that in public health we use GIS as a way to effectively display information and get our point across. And you can see those sort of showed how our country is wrestling with obesity. So how do I use GIS in my own research? Basically, I use GIS to look at what we call the built environment, so neighborhood factors like sidewalks, grocery stores, parks, and see how that relates to obesity and chronic disease. So I usually start with something like the chronic disease. Here we see St. Louis and the diabetes mortality rate. You can see that it's not an equal spread across the city and county. There are certainly some areas that are worse off. Now, as a disclaimer, because you all work with GIS, this is not; these dots are not actual locations of people that died of diabetes. This is a dot density map. So if you're not careful with how you interpret it, you could get some wrong interpretations. This data was actually at the census tract level. So, all right, then you can look at poverty status, see if that is what maybe explains some of the diabetes. We'll just go through these quickly. You look at where the parks are to see if people can be physically active. You look at where fast food chains are. You look at convenience stores, both sources of less than healthy food. Grocery stores, which could be healthier. A lot of people in public health, I'm sure you've heard the term food deserts. You know, it's one of the things we like to look at. Recently, it's been somewhat debunked. It seems that even when you build grocery stores in areas that don't have access to healthy foods, the people that live in the area sometimes don't actually avail themselves of the new healthier foods, and people coming from outside instead. And when you put it all together, you get a big old mess. So this is where I usually throw my hands up and figure out some way to get from the GIS data into a stats program or an Excel spreadsheet. You have to come up with some way to aggregate where people are, the number of grocery stores, and then dump it into something else to do the analysis. The dream is to be able to leave it in GIS and do the analysis here, but I would need more time to develop the skill sets to do that. And why don't I have the time? Because I spend so much time finding, and how does this all relate to the presentation? Because I spend most of my time finding data. You have to go through, find your sources of data, then you have to modify the data to get it in a format that you can use. It's a lot easier now than it was when I started 10 years ago, and things were misprojected and it took a lot of time to get them to the right projection. Usually that's a lot easier now. But then you have to limit your shape files. Those fast food, that shape file that you saw there, that was based on Business Analyst, but unfortunately Business Analyst, they have all of the industry codes, but they don't have an industry code that specifically relates to fast food restaurants. They have a restaurant code, so you have to go through all of those records, do searches for like McDonald's, Burger King, other popular fast food restaurants to create that shape file. So it takes quite a bit of time. And then because there are so many different files that we're dealing with, I take a lot of time re-finding the data. So where are some places where I find my data? So I go to the Census Bureau, the Tiger Line files, Missouri Spatial Data Information Service, various city, county departments of planning, which takes a lot of time to contact them and get the data because it's usually not available readily online. the CDC, and then some various pay sources. So here comes the problem. Once I get this data, where do I store all the data? Here you can see a screenshot of just my external drive on my computer. I also, of course, have the hard drive on the computer and various thumb drives that have various files on them and various CDs. And then when you look inside the drive, what a mess, because as you all know, each of the shape files has multiple files that comes with it. And in when I'm rushing through an analysis, sometimes I'm very bad about labeling certainly the files that GIS will produce for me. So when I go through and limit one of my files based on perhaps another shape file, have it save it out, I'll go with the default name, which tells me nothing in a week when I'm trying to remember where I stored that file. So you end up with a lot of files that it's somewhat difficult to figure out what you've done. So, what are some of the problems that I face that hopefully we can solve, as you'll hear later on? One, trying to locate where I stored files for different projects. Two, trying to remember what I named the files, like we just talked about. When I'm using ArcMap's default names, it doesn't tell me downstream what those files are. Trying to remember how I changed the files when I've modified them with the absence of notes about how I changed them. I usually end up recreating and redoing my work. Concerns about the quality of the files. So I'm getting publicly available files. I don't know what kind of quality they are. I know those Tiger Line files sometimes don't actually put streets where they should be. Lack of access, and this is the big one, to colleagues' files across the department, college, and university. So within the School of Public Health, there are probably 3 of us that use GIS at SLU, but each of us is going out by ourselves, finding all these files, storing them on our own little hard drives, and basically each of us is reinventing the wheel instead of finding a good way to share our work with others. And that problem is compounded as you look across the whole university, and then perhaps also across the city. One of the things that you immediately run into, though, as you start trying to share your files with others, is a lack of normalization of projections. We're all storing files differently. We also are lacking the metadata, so it's not as easy to tell how we're storing our files. And another problem I run into is if I try to change where I've stored my files or I switch computers, I disrupt my linkages. So now I can't just go into ArcGIS, immediately pull down my files. I have to reset up where those folders are. And one of the things I've tried to do is use a program. Everyone's familiar with Dropbox. So I've tried to use Dropbox as a way to sort of share files with colleagues, but you run into the same problem because their Dropbox shared folder will be mapped under their name, whereas my Dropbox shared folder will be mapped under mine, so I have to remap through ArcGIS to find those files. So it's not a very usable solution. So at SLU, some possibilities for the future, and we'll hear more in a second here. They've developed the St. Louis Regional Data Exchange, which we just tested out last week with some varying success. But that holds some promise for the future. And then also the GIS portal. The problem with both of these, though, is they're through individual centers. So unless you know someone in that center and have somehow found out about this, you're not going to know that you have access to this spatial data. So I think my colleagues here are going to present some perhaps better ways to store GIS data. So I'll take questions at the end.